The emotional connection and disappointment with a name that's not available is really big. And so in my process, like I want to minimize heartbreak as much as possible. And I think what you were describing, the process after you realized that that first name wasn't going to work, that you were coming up with lists and everything was unavailable. And it's like, oh my God, how am I ever going to find something? That's the process that I take on for the clients.
Three, two, one. Welcome to the Campfire Circle. I'm your host, Tanya Bhattacharya, and I empower purpose-driven women in building influential personal brands that drive change and raise revenue. We all talk about getting a seat at the table, but why though? Who wants to sit in a stuffy boardroom anyway? Let's reimagine the ultimate space of leadership as a campfire circle, where we share stories that inspire movements, build brave communities to huddle together with for warmth, and where there is always room. Come sit with us.
Emily, I'm so excited to have you to ask you all the questions about naming, which is so niche, yet so necessary. And so after getting to know you better in your work, I have seen how you bring such a strategic, like big picture branding mind to this work and your creative writing chops, plus the practicality, right? To really brand and name startups, solopreneurs, everything in between. So I cannot wait to get into this conversation. But first of all, welcome to the podcast. So happy to have you here.
Thank you. I'm so excited.
Yay. Me too. So I start every episode the same way. It's the Campfire Circle. We're all about sharing stories. So can you tell us the story of what you have grown through to become the naming guide that you are today?
Sure. So I used to work at a branding agency called Red Antler. And there I was a strategist and copywriter, and naming fell under that as one of the responsibilities of the role. It was never the main thing I did, or that, the other strategists on the team did. It was always exciting when a startup would come to us and they didn't have a name or they needed a new name, because we would have to brainstorm something for that. And we would really get the whole team together. Even if it wasn't your direct client, you'd still be in the brainstorm. And so whether it was my client or someone else's client, I just started to be the person whose names kept bubbling up to the top. And so I came to be considered the naming specialist, very informally, but the naming specialist at Red Antler. And then beginning of 2019 is when I left Red Antler and went independent. And I was figuring stuff out, but I was like, okay, I can, continue making money doing what I already do, but freelance. And so let me take on strategy projects, copywriting projects, naming projects. Naming projects were the most rare, but they were always the thing that I liked the most and enjoyed the most. And so after about 3 years of doing all those different types of projects on my own, I finally realized, partly through Indie Collective with you, that the only thing that I actually really enjoyed was naming. And so end of last year, beginning of this year, okay, wait, this is going to be out of date, but early 2022, I decided to go all in on naming and take the leap and see, can I just build a business that's just naming, even though, it's not the type of client that's going to come back. If you do your job well, they never have to rename. So yeah, I did that. And now I'm operating under Title Case, the name of my naming consultancy. And now I tell people when they ask me, do I also do strategy or copywriting? I say, nope, I'm just naming.
Oh, there's so much power in that no, because it makes space for that aligned yes. And your face lights up when you talk about naming. And I just want to know more about that. You love naming. What do you find interesting, fun, unique, or just lovable about this niche?
I think it's definitely a puzzle, which I love. And I think it's really fun. I consider it an art and a science. So there's obviously the creative side, which is, coming up with something interesting that like, oh, when you hear it, you can kind of guess what that company or brand might be about. But the science part of it is, can we get this name? Is it available? Can we get the URL? Can we get a trademark? Like, are we going to be able to legally call this company, fill in the blank? And so that, I think, that part is like the guardrails of the puzzle and the framework that you have to work within. It's like, okay, you have to come up with something fun and creative, but you have to come up with something fun and creative that no one else has ever come up with before and like beat them to the trademark punch. And I think it's also, what I like about it is that it's more objective than subjective. Like, I think brand strategy and copywriting are great. I no longer enjoy that. I think I got a little bit burnt out. But I think it's partially because there's always like, well, what if we did it this way? Or what if we wrote it that way? Or what if we said it this way? And like, yeah, you could like endlessly iterate brand strategy or copywriting. And like people do all the time. They're always refreshing their website and, changing packaging copy and all of that. But with naming, there's less room for that because there are yes and no's to like, well, what about this one? It's like, nope, we can't get it. Like that, we'll just never, it closes the door on that. So there's like, it's a puzzle. There are answers to be found as opposed to just like an endless hamster wheel of brainstorming, which like that is what burnt me out, was just like the endless revisions and like, let's try it this way. Let's try it this way. And it's like, ugh, will it ever be, good enough? Whereas naming, there is subjectivity, but there are more definitive answers and yeses and nos.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like an escape room. Like, I feel like, yeah. Like, and if you do the pieces, you escape and you have this beautiful name that you get to be excited about and tell everybody about. And, so you said if you do your job right, you only have to name once. You don't have to rebrand or rename. And that's true. But something that I have realized now that I'm in year 2, by the time this comes out, year 3 in business, is that like, it's not just about naming the business, but, especially in this work around getting visible, becoming a thought leader, growing our brand, we then have to eventually, potentially name campaigns, new offers, podcasts, books. Like I just got off a call with somebody who was trying to name her book. We talked about a lot of things on that call, but we just keep having to name things. And so tell me more about your framework. Like, if you know me, I love a good framework. How do you bring people through this process from like soup to nuts of birthing this name?
So I think with any name endeavor, whether it's, a trademarkable brand name or just the name of, a product or a book that like doesn't necessarily need a trademark, I think it's always important to start with naming criteria. And that really helps keep the process as objective and strategic as possible, as opposed to what about this? What about this? Just like a battle of opinions. And so first we start with, okay, what's the naming criteria? And generally, like if we are going to be dealing with trademarks down the road, it's like, okay, what trademark class does this have to be in? And then we talk about like what, sort of like what vibe do we want? Should this feel aspirational or really accessible? Should it like, who's the target audience? What do we want them to feel like? Just thinking about, this is kind of where the brand strategy piece comes in that like, I guess I couldn't really escape from brand strategy, but it comes in at the start to be like understanding everything, the ultimate vision of what you're creating right now and therefore naming, and understanding that holistically to get a sense of like, okay, what does the name need to achieve? And, who does it need to speak to? How does it need to feel? What instances does it need to work in? And that can even be something like, if you know that you're going to have, this line of products coming out in the future, you might want to consider that as you name the brand above it. And then you can start to think like, oh, well, when we, do that, then we can sort of, we can establish this framework for all those little products based off of this name. And this gives us a runway. And that's sometimes what gets discussed in the presentation of names. Sometimes there are those easy avenues out of a brand name into future product names. So we can talk about like, oh, if you go with this, that lends itself really easily to like this product and that product. And, you can make a whole naming convention out of this thing. So getting really clear about what the objectives are for the name is key, which can sometimes be hard, to think so far in the future when you're starting. Usually when you're naming, you're like, the thing you're naming is new. Thinking as far ahead as possible to understand, like, how do we want this to grow and expand and what do we need it to encompass is important to consider as you're naming the thing itself, because you want to give it that longevity to be able to expand and hold and flex as needed to encompass all the things you want to achieve with it.
I think that's great practice of being visionary, because the reality is, whatever we're working on, whether it's a nonprofit, whether it's a company, a business, a campaign, it's meant to be long lasting. So I think getting into the practice of thinking, okay, what do I want the impact to be a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now is a good practice to be in. And I think that getting into getting into a naming mindset helps us do that. So like, for example, my whole vibe is about like the Campfire Circle, and, rooting into that has helped me get creative. Like, for example, I just recently came out with a tiny offer for only my alumni called like s'more hours. It's like some more hours. Yeah. It's like a little tune up as they get ready for the new year and they want to like rewrite their story. It's like a little piece of a container, or even with the Kindling Collective. So I knew I wanted to like go deep on this with you during my process of trying to name my group program, because that was a process and it was tough, because you probably hear this all the time. I had a vision in my mind. I had a name in mind that I had already fallen in love with. Like I was calling it that internally. My strategy coach had already drawn up stuff for me with that name on the documents. And of course, the first thing you're supposed to do is check if that name exists. I had not done that. So unfortunately, I realized a little bit too late that it was already taken. And then I came up with lists. Like I started brainstorming. I started coming up with new ideas. And it felt like everything was taken. I was just like, But then once I settled on what I did, which is the Kindling Collective, like I have grown into the process of loving it, because it does tell a story, right? It talks about how this work is made up of small, bite-sized collective actions that can spark a movement. But like, I feel like it can be really easy to get discouraged because all the names that we want are taken, Have you ever had to like usher somebody through that process?
Yes. So I would say typically the types of clients I'm working with, I tend to work with a lot of pre-launch startups. So usually they have no name, which is nice. There's a blank slate. But also I would say maybe 60% of the time they have no name. 40% of the time they have, a placeholder name, or they've had similar to what you were saying, like, oh, a name. They didn't look into it yet, but like, oh, it feels right. And then when they realize they'll never be able to move forward with it, they're coming to me. And so it is like, there is an emotional attachment to that name, which is hard. But I think like focusing on the fact that just like the practicality of like, you can't get this, so we have to move on, unfortunately. It's always harder to rename than to name, mostly because of that emotional attachment. And, that name is what everything is going to be compared to. So yes, the emotional connection and disappointment with a name that's not available is really big. And so in my process, like I want to minimize heartbreak as much as possible. And I think what you were describing, the process after you realized that that first name wasn't going to work, that you were coming up with lists and everything was unavailable. And it was like, oh my God, how am I ever going to find something? That's the process that I take on for the clients. And so I do all the brainstorming and researching, and I don't show anything to my clients unless I have confirmed that like, okay, it looks good. I can't guarantee anything because I'm not working for the trademark office, but I can see what red flags are there, what, obstacles we'll never get over, stuff like that. So I end up presenting, it's a much smaller list, but it's, this curated list that meets that naming criteria we've established, hits, checks all the boxes. And also there's a very high likelihood that you can actually get this. And so I find that really helps and keeps the process more objective and strategic and level-headed than, emotional roller coaster of heartbreak and, oh, we really loved this, which I think can happen in other naming processes that I've seen where there's like, first we show you 50 names and now we're going to narrow it down. And it just feels messy to me when, to show a name that you might not ever be able to get feels like a risk I would rather not take. And so I like to focus things on like, what can we actually work with? And, of these 5 names, like they're all different. They all have their pros and cons, but like we can get them all. And so they're all great choices. It's just a matter of afterwards branding, like, what levers do we need to pull with design and messaging and all of that to balance out whatever the name ends up being.
Totally. So I want to know more about then how you work with people. So I know you have 2 different ways that you normally work with clients, 2 kind of different containers depending on how the level of intensity. Can you talk to me a little bit about how you work with your clients on naming?
Sure. So I basically have a full service option, and which I have sort of been describing to you. And then I have more of a DIY, or as I call it, name it yourself, launchpad option. And the difference is mostly my creative brainstorming involvement as well as budget considerations. So the first option, the full service strategic naming sprint, that is where at the kickoff, I have them fill out an intake form to really give me all those brand strategy questions of like, who's the target audience? What do you want them to feel? What's the problem you're solving? What do you want to be known for? All of that. So that I'm up to speed on the business when we kick off. And I walk them through the principles of naming, everything to understand like what a name can and cannot do, because it can't do everything. The name is not your whole brand. It's just a piece of your brand. And then we talk about that naming criteria and get clear on what do we want this name to achieve and what objectives do we need to hit. So that's a very collaborative process, like getting clear on the naming criteria, making sure everyone feels good about that. And then that becomes the rubric for moving forward. So then I take that and do my creative brainstorming where I try to, go really wide and see like what different territories can we explore that will get a name that, hits these various checkboxes on the naming criteria. And then also going deep. And the depth comes from, when I'm coming up with names and then I'm checking them and, 98% of them are coming back unavailable. So that process, that back and forth is like, okay, I really liked that name. That was so like, oh, it was such a good, metaphor or symbol or whatever. Not available. Okay, but like, what is another way that we can still communicate that idea and like get that? And so it's just like a back and forth until, one brilliant solution pops out and it's like, okay, that is like this type of name. And then I try to do that so that there's, it's a short list, but I want them to be varied. So one name might be a little bit more serious. One might be a little bit more playful. One might be, symbolic, whereas another is more evocative. And maybe I want there to be variety. It's not just going to be, 5 different species of trees, that all stand for strength or whatever. And then, I present these and give the stories behind the names and how I got there and like what this could represent. And we talk through what the branding implications are for those names. So like, say there is one that's maybe a bit more serious. Well, okay, then maybe the brand visuals are more playful and vice versa. Say that there's like a more feminine name. Okay, let's like butch it up with a more serious, sober brand style. And that, I think also the fact that I've worked at a branding agency with designers and understand the translation from brand strategy to visuals, I can sort of speak to and reassure them that like the designer knows that even if this is, I named last year, I worked on a company and we named them Pisces. And I made it very clear, like, there will be no fish in this. There will be no astrology symbols in this brand. Like, the designers know to stay away from that because that would be, too obvious and expected. And they will know how to balance out whatever name you come to them with. So that's something that we talk about a lot in that first kickoff meeting, is understanding like what a name can do and what a name can't do and what we should expect of a name and what we can't expect of a name. And it's more about having somewhat of a blank canvas that you can build meaning into and build a brand upon, rather than, hoping for a name that's going to jump off the page and kiss you on the cheek and tell you it loves you. Like, it's a much more, calm, objective process to be like, what are the pros and cons and strengths and weaknesses of this name? Like, how will this lend itself to our future endeavors? And like, how do we feel about using this name moving forward? And opinions obviously matter. And I want everyone who I'm working with to like the name that they're going to get. But I think sometimes, similar to what you said, you grow to love it because you realize how strategic and well it works for what you're doing and what you need it for.
Right. And it tells the story.
Yeah. Okay. So that was the full service naming sprint. And then at the other end, I have the Name It Yourself Launchpad, which is at a much lower price point. And I know that this is more for, I would say, like founders like you and me, where it's like business of one. I was a freelancer and now, I'm considering myself an entrepreneur and leveling up a bit, as opposed to that the naming sprint is more often used for startups who have some VC money. But regardless of budget, I want people to be able to name their company in a smart and strategic way. And so the Name It Yourself Launchpad gives people the tools and the framework that I use, but they're basically doing the brainstorming on their own. So it's a 90-minute workshop. We are basically doing a lot of that upfront, like principles of naming, let's establish the naming criteria together. And then we have a little brainstorm activity where we start to think about like, what types of names do we want to represent this company? And then we do an exercise to like start generating names quickly to get them to understand that, like, I don't want to say it's a numbers game, but you do have to have a lot of volume of ideas because just the odds are that someone else has already thought of that first in your trademark category. So getting over the like perfectionism of, oh, I have to write the best name right now. And it's more of just like a little bit of word vomit, like strategic word vomit, but like, okay, just get the ideas out and that'll help you snowball and then you'll get to something and one of them will work. And so that there's that 90-minute workshop. And then that includes, I'm able to do the trademark search for up to 5 names, either, maybe at the end of that meeting, there's 1 or 2 that we really, that sound exciting and we want to research. So we do that right away. Or, they want to spend some more time brainstorming and like really take their time and come back to me with the ones they want to research. And then after that, there's a la carte. I'm happy to continue researching names, but it's just like at a nominal fee after those first 5. And then there's also, because there are just always, roadblocks and obstacles in the naming journey, there's the option to add on 30-minute regroups with me. So, if they keep getting trademark reports back that are saying like, no, and they're just like hitting a wall creatively and want to have a regroup with an outside party, like I'm happy to spend some time like brainstorming more or strategizing like other areas they might want to explore. So it's sort of pay as you go process. I'm offering my support and my tools and my strategy to them, but you really are naming it yourself. And I'm happy to offer feedback. And so I think that's also, some people will like, your business is your baby and you want to feel like you named it and you came up with that. So I think, budget aside, like some people just prefer to do that to be able to feel more connected to that naming process.
Hey, if anything you're hearing today inspires you to get more visible as a go-to trusted voice for your audience and drive change towards your deeper mission, I've got something for you. LinkedIn is my favorite place to share my stories and build relationships with my co-conspirators and brand new friends. So I put together a free resource with 14 prompts to create your next post on LinkedIn. Take all the guesswork out of what to say and just start building your impact and influence. Be sure to tag me in your post so I can come by, cheer you on, and amplify your message. You can find those free prompts in the show notes. Okay, back to the episode.
Amazing. I love hearing how you work with clients, but you know what I would love to ask you, because I see this time and time again, or maybe I just see it in myself very intensely, which sometimes it can be difficult to do what we do expertly for other people, for ourselves. So I'm super curious about your process in naming your own company Title Case. How did that come about?
Okay, so originally, when I first went independent, I didn't have an LLC, and because I didn't know what I was doing, and I was like, maybe I'll get a full-time job somewhere, who knows? So I just didn't feel like I needed one, and so I didn't get one. And then 2 or 3 years in, I was finally like, okay, let me just formalize this. And that was still when I was doing strategy, copywriting, naming all together. And I just like needed an LLC. I needed to name it something. And so the work I've gotten and clients I've gotten have largely been through my network of like past Red Antler employees that I worked with there. And everyone knew me there as MG. And so I named my LLC OMG LLC. And like OMG. Anyways, it's kind of annoying to like spell over the phone to people, which is part of the naming do no harm thing. But it was just something that like I needed to do, whatever. Then when I decided that I'm going to go all in on naming, I was like, okay, if I'm going to be a naming consultant, I need to have a pretty good name. And it happens. I was like doing naming research for one of my projects, and I think I had been just thinking about like, oh, what would my name be? And so I was kind of like working on that on the side, but like very loosely. And there was definitely like a few things off the top of my head that like, as I would come up with them, I would look to see like, oh, could I get that? And I don't remember. I wish I had a better story. I don't remember exactly what led me in the thought process to Title Case, but I thought that, I liked it for a lot of reasons. Title Case is the typography case that you would write a title in. So it's like names appear in Title Case. And I also liked that it has what I've been talking about, this idea of the science and the making an argument for the names and, does it check all these boxes? Is it going to work more than like, do you love it? Like, yes, you should love it, but that's sort of at the bottom of the checklist. And so it's like, I'm making case for the titles of these companies. And then I looked it up and it was free. And I was just like, amazing, it's free. I'm going to do that. And so, yeah, that was the story of Title Case coming about. It ended up being a much easier process than the whole cobbler has no shoes mishap.
I love it because it checks off all the boxes you want. It's strategic, it's fun and like thoughtful, and it makes sense. And it was free. It was taken, which is like always a hallelujah moment. So you mentioned this piece around naming do no harm, like do no harm around naming. So how might somebody know that they should change the name of something? And it doesn't necessarily have to be the name of their company. Like I'm thinking about some of the people I work with and maybe the folks who are listening to this. It might not be the name of their company, but maybe they've had a gala for many years and it's time to do maybe something different, or they've had a newsletter or a podcast, or they're getting ready for moving their virtual summit into an in-person summit. Like the world is changing so rapidly around us. What might be some of the signs or symptoms that we should change the name of something we're doing?
I think that I'm very much of the belief of like, if it's not broken, don't fix it. And so I think if you're going to change the name of something, there should be a very good reason to change it. And I've had like, I've written about this a bit where I turn people away from working with me all the time because I don't think that they need to spend money hiring someone to give them a new name when they have a perfectly fine name that, and maybe it's more of like a rebrand exercise that they need more so than a name. But I think in that case, like if people come to me and they're like, well, we have this name and it's available and we're just not sure, like we do like it. There's a lot of meaning. I had a call like this a couple weeks ago and on the phone, I was like, well, I mean, yeah, like I think this, it's short. It's like pretty easy to spell. You can get it. You like it. There's a story behind it. Like, I don't think you need to hire me because it sounds like you have a name and you can build a lot of meaning and story into this. I think that when people do need to rename, it's often an availability conflict. That's usually like the biggest thing that gets people to understand like, okay, like I cannot do this without being sued. I cannot move forward with this name without being sued. But I think other things are, and this gets into the do no harm aspect of it, is, maybe your business has, or your offering or whatever it is, maybe you've sort of pivoted and the name that you once launched with doesn't really make as much sense. Like you see it sometimes, I think like MailChimp, they had to do a campaign of like, we're more than just mail. Like it's more than just email. Like if you're always having to explain like, well, actually, we do this or we're focused on this, like that might be a sign to change your name. If like you're always explaining what you do or like the name is misleading, like they think, oh, you do email, but really I don't even know what MailChimp does at this point. I'm sure they do a lot. The other reason to rename would be, I think, okay, and this is more like rename, but also just naming in general, do no harm, is like, it should be easy to hear, say, spell. When I was explaining the OMG LLC thing, I had to, because title case is a DBA for OMG LLC, and I had to call the New York State business whatever department, and over the phone I'm like, it's OH space EM space G space LLC. Like that's not a fun thing to have to do. And so if you're constantly like, oh, it's Dalmatian, but there's a Y instead of an I, and like you're always explaining, or it's like it's bubble with no vowels, and you're just always explaining what your name is and spelling it, like that's a reason to maybe look for something else. And that's also in the names that I present, I always try to avoid those like, typical like millennial startup misspelling names. Like they chose those names for a reason because they're easy to get because of the availability or the lack of availability conflicts with like a weird jumbled letter name, but then you end up having to explain like, oh, it's Grinder with no E. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a successful brand, so that's fine. But as the number of trademarks grow and the number of name conflicts grow, you feel forced to create some like weird jumble of letters, but there are ways around that, and you just have to get creative to see like, okay, what's like a easy to hear, say, spell name that can still work within the confines that we need it to. And then I think the other thing with do no harm is maybe a bit more obvious of like, it shouldn't mean anything bad. It shouldn't have any, like, we're not naming anything Hitler, like, or it shouldn't, be a bad word in another language. Like, just like kind of doing due diligence to make sure, like, we do not want to be doing harm in any way. There was a project when I was at Red Antler that we had to rename. It was a kids, like, healthy Lunchables, like pre-packed lunch for kids. And the name that they originally had was like if you Googled that name and went to the website, it was like a Russian porn site. Like,
oh no,
a new name,
no.
like stuff like that. Like, what pops up on Google? Like, you just want to be, and everyone is going to have connotations with every type of word and name. And it's like, when you think about when people are naming their kids, it's like, oh, we're going to name our kid Emily. And you tell someone and they're like, oh, I knew an Emily in 3rd grade and she was such a bitch. Like, you shouldn't name, like, there's that. But, or like if someone, like I said, Dalmatian earlier, oh, like Dalmatians, they're, someone doesn't like a Dalmatian. Like, that's less of an issue than Hitler.
Totally. That makes a lot of sense. There's so much to think about when you go into it, but I think that as long as you have that intention and maybe, that strategic support with somebody like you, you can get there to that beautiful name. So I have one last question for you. And this is perfect because we're going from kind of like the scary story to like the beautiful visionary story, which is, and I ask this of everyone, I'm so curious about your answer. What's the big dreamy vision for the future, either for yourself or for the people that you serve, that can be possible through naming?
I think I have 2 visions. I think, there's the vision I have for the people I work with, that I care about naming and think naming is important, but I want people to understand that naming isn't everything. It's like one piece of the brand puzzle, and you don't have to put so much weight on it. And like, if it's, I think sometimes the expectations of a name can maybe distract from it can be a bottleneck. It can distract it. Like, there's so much, I would say, potentially unnecessary weight sometimes put on a name. And it's like, it's not the name, it's the brand that people remember. And like, I always ask my clients, like, oh, what are some of your favorite brand names, like from any category? And sometimes people answer in the way that I am asking the question of like, oh, this name, Staples, for instance, like the office supply store, like that's a really cool, like, it's Staples for paper, but it's also like the Staples, the necessity, like, okay, that's an example of a brand name. As opposed to sometimes people come back to me and they're like, oh, Goldman Sachs, like that's a really strong brand. And it's like, but you're talking about the brand, not the name. The name is just 2 guys' last names. So I think my vision would be to just like take some of the pressure off name and understand that like it's more about a blank canvas and like a do no harm, and like than this amazing thing that stands all on its own. And just in general, like maybe that ladders up to a vision for like less perfectionism in the world and like needing things to be like so amazing, better than anyone else, like competitiveness. Like we should all just like, no, it works. It's good. Yeah, we can move forward with this. Like it's great in its own way. And I think my vision for myself, maybe it is connected to that last thing. Wow, this question is really opening my mind right now. Is like,
as it should.
I just want to like have a like peaceful, happy life. And that's why I decided, even though it was scary and like, oh God, there aren't that many people who need naming help. Like I didn't want to do the things that I was doing that I didn't enjoy anymore, and wanted to just like not hate my work and not dread it, but actually enjoy it. And I want that for every aspect of my life. And so I want to, do work I enjoy and think is fun, and live somewhere I enjoy and can, take advantage of. And I'm about to embark on a European adventure to see like where I should live in the world. But yeah, just like more peaceful, calm, relaxed days for everyone.
That is such a good answer, Emily. That is such a good, thoughtful answer, because you're right. I think on the first piece around like for the people you serve, people do get really, I'm just speaking for myself. Like I was so hung up on this because it feels like you can't start until you have the perfect name. But it's like I tell my people all the time, like, how can you infuse play into this? And it's really not about the name. It's about the brand, like you said, and it's about the why. It's about the story. It's about what does that mean? And I have loved watching you as a member of my A team, as a colleague, really settle into what it is that you love and, let go of the rest, because you have bet on yourself and you know that you have the ability, the passion, the strategic mind, you have all the pieces needed and the right people are coming. And so I've seen this kind of like this journey for you. And I have loved to see it. I have loved to see it. Thank you for being on the show, sharing all your wisdom with us. This was such a great combo.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. This was so fun.
Yes. So welcome.
What'd you think? Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, or even better, reach out and let me know through lumosmarketing.co. Yes, that's Lumos, as in the illumination spell from Harry Potter. Because when you shine, magical things happen. You can get social with me on LinkedIn, and of course, check out the show notes to stay in touch with our guests. Let's talk soon.